Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a session on Lebensraum, a German word which means living space. This is a theoretical construct that was put together by Friedrich Ratzel, a geographer, a German geographer, in the late 19th century, and in many respects, it both reflected the existing trends of the German Empire and its imperial ambitions for expansion, um, as well as German nationalism in its embryonic stage. We have to remember that Germany did not exist before 1870. There were Germanic states. Prussia was the state that unified the rest of the Germanic states. And Prussia had a long-standing culture of militarism, and Germany was unified by the uh, man who became the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, a Prussian aristocrat, a Junker, the name for the landowning aristocracy in Prussia. And these people were immersed in the mythology of the Teutonic race, the Aryan race, and its superiority. And they were immersed in the mythology of nationalism as a new nation state, unlike England and France, for example, which were much older nation states. As a new nation state, it had a voracious appetite, a huge appetite for hegemony. Okay, it made no secret of that. It made no secret of that. The quest for hegemony is what caused a number of imperialist wars, most importantly, the Boer War in South Africa in 1899-1902, which was, in fact, a signal. And a British scholar, John Hobson, pointed that out in a work entitled, two-volume work, I believe it was, entitled Imperialism, warning that this will lead to a global war, this regional war of imperialism. Lebensraum was a theoretical construct, a pseudo-scientific theory that was eclectic ideologically. It borrowed from nationalism. It borrowed from social Darwinism. The not Darwinism, the survival of the fittest theory, but the racist social Darwinist theory that those, presumably the Eurocentric mindset, of course, the Eurocentric mindset, who are superior culturally, biologically, intellectually, have the right to dominate, survive, and at the expense of children of a lesser God, so to speak, which is exactly what had been happening in Europe. Europe had expanded outward since the 15th century when the Portuguese landed in Africa. They had engaged in the transatlantic trade, that's a matter of record, transporting millions of Africans to the Western Hemisphere. Dividing Africa in the late 19th century, the so-called partition of Africa, right? Germany was a latecomer, right? So it had the opportunity to receive very few of these colonial benefits, right? And it made no secret that it wanted the status of a hegemonic power comparable to what Great Britain was enjoying, what England was enjoying. They wanted to be another England as long as Bismarck was around on the continent. Once Bismarck was removed in 1890 by Kaiser Wilhelm II, they wanted both to be both a land-based power and a naval power, which of course is what led to World War One. The theory of the pseudoscientific racist supremacy theory of Lebensraum was actually assumed to be science. It became mainstream, not just because an academic came up with it. Academics usually come up with this stuff anyway. And he had the status, okay, arguing that in fact, taking a combination of theories and putting them together to come up with Lebensraum. The Malthusian theory, Thomas Malthus, of course, 100 years before Ratzel was an English demographer and scholar who came up with a theory of the asymmetry between the gap between natural resources down here and the population rising very rapidly, and obviously um, consuming those natural resources. So this race for natural resources, and then of course the Darwinian theory of evolution and the survival of the fittest organisms adapting to their environment, turned upside down, of course, by social Darwinists who were in fact white supremacists and fit right in with the era of imperialism, of Western expansion. Friedrich Ratzel used all of this, as well as German mythology of superiority, the idea of Aryan race superiority. To now, I want to caution because of the way I'm phrasing it. Perhaps I should have done that. I want to say that in fact this is how it was interpreted later on, especially by Adolf Hitler and Nazis. Initially, his argument was that we need more land. We ought to have the land. Land is important because the population will be growing. And especially, by the way, this is a detail that may not make much difference today, but back then it was a detail that was important, despite the fact that Germany had industrialized in any case by the time Friedrich Ratzel was writing. That we need the land for farmland and we need natural resources, we need to spread out and so forth. The question is, whose land? And what do you do with the people who are already there? What do you do with those people? Well, here's where he was influenced by the American westward movement. Okay. And another academic, a Harvard University professor, Frederick Jackson Turner, who, of course, believed, came up with the so-called frontier thesis. The frontier thesis, of course, was a reality. He was already reflecting, the frontier thesis was reflecting the reality of the westward movement that had been going on, especially from Andrew Jackson in the 1830s onward, all the way to the 19th century. So the American westward movement, which had an ideology that appealed to the Lebensraum theoretician, Ratzel and his followers, namely Manifest Destiny, the mandate from God to be hegemonic. These Native Americans, namely the Indians, must make way. They must make way for the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant race. Although race, by the way, I should tell you, is a myth. The idea of race is a myth. There is no science to back up the concept of race. There is one race, it's the human race. There is no such thing as Anglo-Saxon race or Teutonic race or Aryan. That's all nonsense. The idea that somehow there is purity based on race constructs intended solely to demonstrate that I am superior. Therefore accord the mandate, which by the way came from God anyway, to myself to take your land, shove you aside, eliminate you if necessary, which is exactly what happened. And you can see that this sort of thinking feeds nationalism. By the way, the late 19th century, all the way up to 1914, which is known as the age of new imperialism, is also known and is it's known. It's also known as the age of materialism, but it's also known as the age of nationalism. Na- Nationalism is at its height during this period. One reason, by the way, is because Germany unifies in 1870. So they're very nationalistic because they're a young country and very insecure, and they have a huge appetite for land, for and hegemony, colonies, and who is they going to take? People they regarded lesser than themselves in the let me be precise, in the global south, okay, and in Eastern Europe, Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, those people. Eastward, move eastward. Lebensraum was predicated on the eastward drive of Germany. Exactly what the Third Reich did, by the way. That's exactly the foreign policy did. There is remarkable continuity, and if those of you who have studied the history of Germany, 19th and 20th century, not at the high school level, by the way, sorry to say, but at the college level and by serious works, especially by solid German scholars, including Fritz Fischer, I should say, you know that there is remarkable continuity between the pre-World War One and the pre-World War Two arena and the conditions and then the policies. Hitler followed some of the same assumptions about Germany's war aims, as Fritz Fischer pointed out, as the Germans who were not Nazis before World War One. So Lebensraum was not Hitler's invention. This existed long before Hitler, who was Austrian, by the way. This existed in the late 19th century. Now, let me point out that Lebensraum served, and this is very important because of what happened in the United States with its manifest destiny and westward, which was the ideology to justify the westward movement at the expense of Native Americans. But also what happened, and we'll see this today, what happened later with Israel under the Zionist apartheid state. Um, Lebensraum actually has served as a catalyst, whether in Germany, in the United States, or in Israel under the Zionist state. It has served as a catalyst to unify the base around the Lebensraum goals of the state. So it serves a domestic purpose, although it's about outward expansion. It serves a domestic purpose to keep the masses loyal under the flag and the label of nationalism. And by the way, it makes them feel good. Hey, you're superior. Don't you feel good? The other people, that's we'll talk more, a lot more about this one too. The other people, namely those who are our victims, are not only inferior, they are evil. So they are demonized. By the way, yes, the victims are demonized. Whether it was in the case of Germany, who demonized their victims, in the case of the United States, demonizing the Native Americans, or in the case of the Zionists, demonizing the Palestinians, or anyone who stands in their way, who tries to obstruct the goals of Lebensraum. Okay. Now, I want to point out that theoretical models such as this, which are pseudoscientific, were actually taught in schools, not just in Germany, by the way, unfortunately, but in the United States. The fact is that the two intellectuals that I mentioned were part of the were part of the mainstream. They were not outside the mainstream. The Frederick Jackson Turner was a Harvard University professor. Okay, that's as mainstream as you can get. And Friedrich Ratzel was also a university professor, Heidelberg, I believe. I believe he taught at Heidelberg University. Um, their views were mainstream views of the elites, which then influenced the hegemonic culture that absorbed um, these goals, made them their own, because they had an interest, by the way, in the elites had an interest in this. There are tangible interests behind all of this theory. Why would they embrace this racist pseudoscientific theory based on supremacist assumptions? Because they made money. They made money. And it made them feel, in fact, they believe it. They actually believe that they were superior to the rest of humanity. And that God, that Calvin is thinking, that God had chosen them, had preordained them. In the case of the Zionists, of course, God's chosen people. So you have very dogmatic ideological mindset here. It permeates the hegemonic culture and then the subcultures behind it. So it becomes mainstream in society. So people accept it as the norm. Oh, this is the norm. This is why would anyone question the norm? Of course, Native Americans are savages. Of course, Palestinians are terrorists. Of course, the Jews, as far as the Germans were concerned, were evil. Of course, Slavs were inferior. So if they're inferior, why not eliminate them? Why not get them out of the way and take their land, right? So you have the mind determining policy, used to justify determine policy. But in the end, there are tangible interests that are served. Okay. And those interests do not accrue to the entire population. The entire population is there to support the mainstream institutional thinking, but they're not the beneficiaries. They may feel good. Oh, I'm German, I'm superior to the Slavs. I'm a Jewish citizen. I feel great because I'm superior to the Palestinian in Gaza. I'm a white Anglo-Saxon in Wisconsin. I feel superior to the Cherokee Indians. They're inferior. Okay, they feel good, superior, right? Putting that delusion aside, because that's all it is. It's delusional thinking, which is dangerous, by the way, because that kind of delusional thinking leads citizens to support mass destruction in the form of warfare. In the name of what? Superiority. A mental construct intended, we go right back to who benefits from it. Now, in 1961, a great German historian, I already mentioned his name, and I'm going to stick with him. But there are many, many books on this, by the way. Others have supported this thesis, the Fisher thesis. Wrote a book called World Power or Decline. Um, the mindset of Germany, according to Fisher, was that Germany must either become a world power, a hegemonic power, or in the future, looking down the road in the 20th century, it would decline. So it was either Lebensraum, in other words, space and race, right? At whose expense? That's why we had World War One, by the way, and then World War Two. At whose expense? Other people who were already there, inferior, to be eliminated, their land taken, they would be subjugated, they would be second-class citizens. And of course, in the process, many of them would die. The Fisher thesis was very important because he was the first to use archival material that back then, of course, there was East and West Germany. East Germany allowed him to look at the archives. They had the archives from that period, and indeed, the Germany's war aims, and he also wrote a manuscript by the exact same title, Germany's war aims. Germany war aims were indeed based on Lebensraum. So there was no doubt about it. Now, this is another form of imperialism. So this is not out of the blue. This is the era, 1870, remember, 1870, 1914 is called the era of new imperialism. Japan was imperialist, the US was imperialist, all of Western Europe was imperialist. Russia was engaged in imperialism, especially internal imperialism, but they also went to war against Japan over Manchuria, the Northeast, in which war, of course, Russia lost. Japan war, won, by the way. But the fact is that the major powers, the great powers as they were called, the great powers, were imperialist. So Lebensraum comes along. I mean, the Germans come up with his theory. It's mainstream. It's also true, by the way, that it's not that they had exclusive. I don't want to come across as somehow demonizing Germans alone. The fact is that the Europeans, period, the white European elites have been benefiting from colonialism ever since the 15th century. Okay, during the transition from the feudal manorial political economy to capitalism. When the Europeans expanded outwards and they went for the entire global south, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Okay. They had to develop an ideology of race, an ideology based on uh, superiority that to justify why they were doing what they were doing. They were conquerors. They had to justify why conquer the global south. And one of the justifications, there were many, by the way, from Christianizing them to civilizing them to we're superior, right? On the basis of what? Rejecting their culture, dismissing them as barbarians. Imagine this: you're in a philosophy course in college, and it's a course on logic. And the professor says the barbarians are those who go and colonize, eliminate the native population in their own land, reduce them to second class citizens, exploit their labor, exploit their natural resources, and yet they're the barbarians, not the exploiters, not the colonizers who set up a colonial regime under military control to perpetually impose hegemony. Imagine that you are in a college course and the professor says that. Okay, how would you react to that? What kind of logic is this? Because remember, the Vietnamese did not, or the Cambodians did not go to France to colonize France. The French did that. The Nigerians did not go to England to colonize England. The English did that. Okay. The Indonesians did not go to Holland. Holland went to Indonesia. The Dutch went to Indonesia. Okay. So remember that the exploitation, okay, the outward expansion was from Northwest Europe, the United States, and Japan. That's where the expansion. So Lebensraum is taking place against this background. So the Fritz Fischer thesis, okay, seems to make sense. It's part of the norm, right? He says. Of course, Fritz Fischer was a critic. I don't want to give you the wrong impression, a severe critic of what the Germans were doing, German foreign policy. But it was mainstream, and it wasn't just the Germans. It was Northwest Europe, Russia, Japan, the United States. Okay, so Lebensraum was just part of that larger picture. Let me go to the what happens, why Lebensraum becomes so destructive, in particular with Germany, and then I'll come to the United States and end with Israel. Um, when World War One ended, there were negotiations in Paris, and Woodrow Wilson, of course, was the dominant party because the U.S. really, without the U.S., France and Germany would have lost most likely. The U.S. went in, it proposed a lot of the peace terms. The French and the British insisted on maintaining colonial regimes. Okay, the U.S. had reservations about that. The Wilson had a lot of reservations about a number of European policies. The one of the things that they did at the Treaty of Versailles, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed, is to punish Germany, by the way, severely. Not only did they pose immense war reparations, in other words, damages for the war that they had to pay, which was a way to keep them economically weak, by the way. But they also um, that was a roundabout way of weakening their military industrial complex, if you will. And they were very specific on limiting their armed forces, their military capacity, because after all, they were charged for starting the war. Although, by the way, World War One, unlike World War Two, you can argue that all of them were reaching for war, not just the Germans, but all of Europe was itching for war. Um, uh, England was hardly innocent in this regard. So France, England, and the United States punished Germany. And this was, the Treaty of Versailles was the first cause of World War II. Hitler came out of that background, and he tried a coup in Bavaria in 1923. Went to prison in 24. He wrote the book Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf incorporates the Lebensraum thesis, and he makes it a core issue. Now, he didn't come up with it; it was already there. Um, he just took it, like he took a lot of the ideas that were Nazism. After all, is an eclectic ideology itself, right? So Lebensraum becomes a core thesis. So what does he do? When I'm sure all of you, whether you've gone to university level history courses, taken those or not, you know that Hitler moved east. His goal was Eastern Europe, going up to Russia. Huge mistake, the Soviet Union, because Russia at the time was the largest country in the world, and it had the largest military in the world. And occupying Russia was, they had Napoleon learned his lesson. Hitler's own predecessors in World War One learned a lesson. Of course, Vladimir Lenin pulled Russia out when the revolution took place in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, and Germany showed then during the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that it was interested in Lebensraum because it went for a land grab at the expense in the Baltics, at the expense of uh, territory belonging to the old Russian Empire, which became the Soviet Union, of course, after Lenin and Trotsky took over. So what you have is clearly, with its actions, Germany showed that it was um, uh, unyielding when it came to Lebensraum. Even while it was actually, there was no doubt that they were going to lose the war. Although they were hoping they would win, especially as Russia pulls out in 1917 during the revolution. So the West punishes them, okay, punishes them by limiting their ability to achieve Lebensraum. So what does Hitler do? He introduces it as a core value. And when he took over in 1933, he came to office exactly the same month as FDR, as Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, January 1933. Both Roosevelt and Hitler came to office January 1933. Hitler begins to make plans for moving east. Obviously, he took France, but he moved east. And the goal was that Germany would occupy all those areas, use the vast cheap labor and natural resources of the eastern of the east, all the way up to the Soviet Union, to Siberia, which is, by the way, very rich in natural resources, and become hegemonic, world power. The Fritz Fischer thesis, world power or decline. Now, the obviously we know how that ended for Hitler. Not very well. Um, it was a disaster in the process. Okay, he demonized anyone who was against Lebensraum, including, by the way, liberals, communists, and above all, the Jews. And this is where the final solution comes in, namely the Holocaust, which is another name for it, the final solution, which means exterminating the Jews because they're the enemy of obstructing the superiority of the Aryan race. Now, you would think, by the way, and I want to stress this, that the Zionists who come out of this environment would stay as far away and renounce all of this to the most intense degree possible. And yet they do not. As we'll see, when Zionism takes hold, they begin to emulate some of the Lebensraum mindset theories and policies. I want to move on to the United States because the United States also engaged in Lebensraum. version of Lebensraum. After all, the German theoretician who came up with Lebensraum, Ratzel, was influenced very clearly, as were German military officers, politicians, by the way, from the late 19th century all the way to the Third Reich by the United States. They admired many things that the United States was doing. Above all, the westward expansion using manifest destiny as a theoretical cover. God has mandated for us to realize our destiny, this Calvinist notion. Okay, at whose expense? Obviously, the people who were already there, the Native Americans, their land, and of course, marginalizing them, right, in a society that was segregationist. The Civil War had ended, but the sharp division under Jim Crow laws, the so called black codes, of course, which many states practice, had relegated minorities to a second class citizen position, all the way out, down to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So you have basically a society that the Germans admired and learned from it. And in the United States, of course, as I mentioned, we have Frederick Jackson Turner, the Harvard University professor, who was as mainstream as you can get, and of course, accepted as the norm. What he was preaching was accepted as the norm. There was nothing unusual. Yes, and the American culture, the mainstream culture, has the Jackson Turner thesis, the frontier thesis, elevated to mythological levels in everything from novels to movies to history books to the way to sociology to every field you can conceive of. So they are actually teaching with supremacist assumptions in schools. Motion pictures, okay, just took it for granted that the Indians whose land it was and who were killed so their land can be grabbed, taken away from, stolen, in other words, they were the savages. Not the people killing them and taking their land, but the victims were the savages. Think about that. The savage is someone who is sitting in her house, doing whatever, watching TV or cooking or reading a book or writing a book, and someone walks in, grabs her, takes her house, she resists, kills her, and yet the victim is the savage. This is at the core of Lebensraum thinking. Okay, the sugarcoating about the look how they're dressed. They don't believe, first of all, they're not Christians. They don't believe in the one God. They believe in nature spirits. I'm talking about the American Indians. Look how they're dressed. Look how they live. They live in these huts, um, in these teepees, right? Uh, Look at how they their culture. It's primitive. It's barbarian. We don't recognize that. We have a superior white-based European culture, and therefore we have the right to take their land and do as we wish with them, marginalize them. Okay. That was Lebensraum in the United States. Indian reservations, segregate them, put them in reservations. And of course, this was not very difficult because there was already a society based on segregation, given that there was this enormous population of blacks who were formerly slaves who were segregated. So the hierarchical society um, was mainstream. This is what society was. So Lebensraum, I mean, I remember movies from the 1950s and the 1960s, John Wayne movies, where the Indian defending the territory and the buffalo, the game, was the savage because the Indian was on his land defending the territory the whites wanted to take. How dare he not give it up? This is exactly the same thing, the same thinking that Germans had who invented the concept of Lebensraum, but also the Zionists who learned from the Germans and then practiced a variation of Lebensraum in Israel after 1948 when they succeeded in imposing a state there. And we know the tragedy of that unfolding right now. Now, Zionism was a movement that came about when Theodor Herzl started it in Europe in the 1890s, at the same time that Friedrich Ratzel came up with the concept of Lebensraum. Zionism, of course, is the idea of realizing this biblical, mythical place of Israel exclusively for Jews, to the exclusion of the people who were already there when Jews went there, and Palestinians welcomed them, by the way, when no one on the planet would, no one, including the good old US. No, they were welcomed there. And they turned around, took over through what the international community back in the 1940s called terrorist acts, okay? Random acts of violence targeting civilians, in other words, with bombs. And then they imposed an apartheid state. And the goal remains, because this is a long standing goal, Lebensraum, living space and race. The living space and race theory is at the core of Zionism. Now, I recently did another video on what happened on Lebanon, on what has happened in Lebanon the past few days. And I argued because, of course, the Western media continuously to this day maintains that the only goal of Israel is Hezbollah backed by Iran, which of course Hezbollah is backed by Iran because Hezbollah, which means the party of God, by the way, emerges after the 1979 revolution in Iran, which brings about Ayatollah Khomeini in charge of the government in Iran. The goal of Hezbollah was resistance to Israeli expansion. Now, there was no Hezbollah before the Iranian Revolution. In fact, Hezbollah starts out in 1980, 81. It starts to get going. In 1955, there was no Hezbollah. In 1955, the prime minister was Moshe Sharet of Israel. And the army chief of staff was Moshe Dayan. Most of you are familiar with Moshe Dayan. You're most likely not familiar with Moshe Sharet. Anyway, Moshe Sharet in his diary By the way, 1955, there was no Hezbollah. Okay? In 1955, um, the prime minister kept a diary and he wrote that Moshe Dayan had proposed a scheme based on Lebensraum principles. Either pay off or somehow co opt a Lebanese prime minister to be a lackey of Israel, or install a Lebanese junior officer who is also a lackey of Israel, if the first scheme doesn't work, and then annex um, southern Lebanon and make it part of Israel. The plan was also to annex, this is part of the greater Israel scheme, which to this day Zionists, by the way, openly discuss. They don't have any problem with this. They talk about it openly. The greater plan was to take chunks of Syria, uh, all of Transjordan, Jordan today, all of Palestine, chunks of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, create a greater Israel. And they have no problem showing maps with what they would take from Arab countries to make this greater Israel a reality. The idea of Lebensraum in under Zionism has been unfolding since the 1967 war. We have the 1973 war, we have had the settlements, we have had continuous wars. Israel has had a war economy backed by the United States and the West, by the way. And to this day, no matter what international courts have decided regarding the nature of war, labeling it genocide, US ignores that. The Western countries ignore that. Even worse, the Arab countries are doing absolutely nothing other than vacuous rhetoric right and left to assist the Palestinians in tangible ways. There is a lot of we're in diplomatic negotiations. We're talking. Yes, we're talking. We want to get humanitarian aid in Gaza and so forth. Yes, we want to stop the continuous bombardment of Beirut by Israel, where supposedly, by the way, according to Israel, Hezbollah terrorists are there. In the meantime, the victims, there are very few Hezbollah people, members, including top leaders, as you know, including Nasrallah. Um, the head of Hezbollah recently, who was killed, assassinated. Um, the However, the nature of the war is such that, as everyone knows, the victims are civilians. These are Beirut. Beirut is a civilian target. It's not like the Iran, which unleashed about 180 or so drones on Israeli military targets, by the way, take out F-16s and so forth. Military target operation. That was a military target operation. The Pentagon readily acknowledged it immediately, by the way. He was a military operation, according to the Pentagon. They didn't go after Israeli hospitals like the Israelis do, hitting hospitals in Palestinian territories, especially Gaza, obviously, schools, killing journalists, hitting United Nations staff, calling the United Nations Secretary General a persona non grata, by the way, which is slap on the face for the entire world because he represents the entire world. He's the United Nations Secretary General. Okay. So this defiance and demonizing anyone who criticizes Lebensraum is very much at the core of Lebensraum thinking to begin with. This is how these people think, whether it was Germans, Americans, or Zionists. That's how they think. Lebensraum advocates think like this: that the victim and anyone criticizing the aggressor must be demonized and isolated, marginalized. So this is not surprising at all to me because it's totally consistent with the ideology. This is what the ideology is about. I have the right. I'm superior. Whether it was the Germans in the 19th century all the way down to the Third Reich, the Anglo-Saxons getting rid of during the westward movement of the Native Americans, the Indians marginalizing them in reservations, or the Zionists who were actually looking for places from Bolivia to Uganda, wherever they were looking in Africa, in Zaire, and so forth, to get rid of the Palestinians. Take them, we'll pay you. Get rid of them. We want their land. Even worse, the media in the West covers up for all this. There was a great article in Al Jazeera. Yes, Al Jazeera is an Arabic newspaper. But you know what? In comparison with what the West has to offer, it's not that bad. It's not that it doesn't have a point of view. Of course it does. It's not that it doesn't have a bias. Of course it does. It doesn't. It's not that it doesn't have a political angle. Yes, it does. But does it have a grain of truth in its analysis and reporting? Does just a grain of truth? It was a great article about how CNN has been covering for Zionism all along. Now, CNN is a major network and it influences public opinion. And it's not just CNN, by the way. I don't want to, you know, argue that CNN is alone. The fact is, the entire Western media has a long-standing policy of going along with Zionist apartheid and Lebensraum goals, which are the notion of taking the land belonging to the Palestinians, by the way, and then carving up land all around. In This is an old imperialist, by the way. Those of you who have studied 19th century history, this goes back to the 19th century. These are zones of influence. And then, of course, the Yalta Agreement in 1945 with Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, um, carving up East and West, um, you know, legitimize this concept further about zones of influence and so forth. So the Israelis are following the Western pattern of zones of influence, and no apology, by the way, for wanting regional hegemony, even if it means going to war against Iran, which, by the way, Iran is not Syria or Iraq. Iran is a country, a power to be contended, to be reckoned with. It is a serious contender. This doesn't mean Israel, of course, has, I believe, something like 60 or 90 nuclear warheads, depending what you read. But this doesn't mean that Iran will prevail, but it will cause a lot of damage. It will cause enormous damage. It will more than likely suffer more than Israel would, but it will cause enormous damage to Israel. So the self-destructiveness of Lebensraum is the enigma. Why pursue policies of self-destruction while destroying mostly other people when there are diplomatic solutions, political solutions? That's the question. And this is where you have to argue that instead of sending massive billions of dollars of weapons, the West should could have been concentrating on a constructive diplomatic solution to the benefit of everyone. But they don't want stability. They want destabilization because the Western elites benefit from destabilization. And Israel, by the way, is a tiny country. The world has 8 billion people. Israel is 5, 6 million people. That's it. The world has 8 billion people. Israel is but a tiny country. It's not Israel, it's the West. If the West were not behind Israel, this would not be happening. The West has been living the legacy of Lebensraum. I want to end it there. I want to ask you to send comments, to please ask questions. And above all, I want to appeal to you to become members of Asad Alim's channel. Subscribe to the channel, in other words. Please add your name to this and support it. This is an educational channel. He has many guests on. He tries to bring quality material without an agenda. This doesn't mean we don't have a point of view, but there's no agenda, no profit motive, no political uh, uh, purpose here. The only goal here is um, based on anthropocentric values, human-centered values. In other words, the for everything, the analysis is based on consideration for human rights, the good of humanity, the Geneva Convention, observation of international rules of law, not its violation, as the West has been directly or indirectly violating it in both wars, by the way, the Ukraine as well as in Israel. Okay, thank you very much.